Now I'm going to explain to you why sometimes small ball raises before the flop can actually win you more money after the flop. In another section, I spoke about lowering your raises to 2.5 times the big blind. Enough of a raise to get your opponents to fold the garbage hands, but almost forcing them to call with a wide variety of marginal hands. A standard pre-flop raise is generally 3 to 4 times the big blind. But if you're planning on playing lots of pots and raising frequently, you'll do better in the long run when you lower your raise. That way, you'll risk less chips every time you raise and when someone re-raises you before the flop. While at the same time, forcing the player in the big blind to either A, fold a hand that he should have defended with, or B, force him to play a marginal hand out of position against you. Let's take a look at how a typical hand may look. With the blinds at 100, 200 with 25 ante, you raise as the first player to enter the pot with King 10. All fold to the big blind, who looks down at 9-7. To make the call, he would need to call 300. With 9 players at the table, he'd be getting over 3 to 1 odds. Your King 10 rates to beat his 9-7 about 64% of the time, or close to 2 to 1. Now, if the big blind folds, that is an excellent result for you. You forced him into a mistake. You laid him 3.4 to 1 odds on a proposition where he was only a 2 to 1 underdog. Obviously, betting after the hand and the positional disadvantage had a major effect on the result. That's where the power of small ball really starts to come into play. Here comes the flop. Queen, 6, 4. You still have your king high and your opponent still has his 9 high. Since the player in the big blind missed the flop completely, he will likely check to you. At this point, with 13.25 in the pot, it's yours for the taking. So how much should you bet? Well, there's just no reason to bet more than you need to. If your opponent will fold for 13.25, then he'd also fold for a $1,300 bet. You can take that a step further. Obviously, in this example, the 9-7 will fold to any bet, but generally speaking, a bet of anywhere from 50% to 80% of the pot will give you the desired result. In this case, a bet of 750 or 800 will get your opponent to lay down his hand and give you the pot. At the same time, when you happen to run into a hand, you'll be saving a few bucks on your bluff. Suppose your opponent had ace-queen and was going to check-raise you on the flop. By betting 750 instead of 13.25, you save 575 in chips. Those are chips you could use to attack the next blind. Or suppose you had a hand and flopped the set against your opponent who had ace-queen. You're still making a solid-looking bet, and your opponent may check-raise you just the same. Now, while it's true that you may make more in this specific situation by betting 13.25 rather than 750, it's important to note how rarely a situation like this will come up. More often than not, both you and your opponent will totally miss the flop. Besides, you can make up for the smaller flop bet on the turn or river. You could still potentially get all of your opponent's chips. What you want to avoid is betting the 750 when you're bluffing and then betting 13.25 when you actually have a strong hand. If you do that, it won't be long before your opponents are dialed into your betting pattern. Let's flip the script now and see what happens if you have the 9-7 and your opponent has the king 10 in the blind. So you open the pot with 9-7 and your opponent defends his blind with king 10. Once again, the flop comes queen 6-4. Your opponent misses the flop completely with the king 10 and checks on over to you. You bet out 750 to win 13.25 and your opponent likely folds. Now, ask yourself this question. In this example, does it even matter what you have? I mean, if you had 7-deuce offsuit in position and made this play, would it have mattered at all what you had? No, it wouldn't. You'd still pick up the pot because you aren't playing your cards. You are simply betting on your opponent to miss the flop so you can pick it up with a bet. Having said that, there is no reason to stretch your list of playable starting hands out that far. You'd be much better off playing hands that have actually some potential to make a hand after the flop. Even a hand like 6-4 offsuit has the potential to pay off big for you if you hit the right flop. Now, from time to time, you're going to play against the player that wants to take the pot away from you with a bluff, and that's okay. Back to our example. Let's say you have the king 10 and the blind has the 9-7 again. An aggressive player may check-raise your 750 bet with absolutely nothing. Obviously, you'll let him have the pot with your king 10 and move on to the next hand. It's no big deal, and you have to train your mind to believe that. You have to have faith in the fact that if you keep plugging away, your stack will steadily increase rather than bleed away. You'll go through stretches where you flop absolutely nothing and get raised time and time again. Hey, that's poker. You just need to keep your composure, and eventually you'll start hitting some flops. If not, there's always the next tournament. Having people make plays at you with nothing can actually pay off for you as well. I mean, every once in a while you'll actually have a hand when you bet the 750. The good news is that if your opponent check raises you with nothing on the flop, you'll win yourself some extra chips. After a bet of 750, you can expect your opponent to make it at least 2250 or maybe even as much as 4000 on a bluff. At that point, you'll have options. You can continue to slow play your hand, hoping that your opponent will continue to bluff through the hand, or you could just take it down right there with a re-raise. Your decision should depend on several factors: the texture of the flop, your opponent's tendencies, as well as how many chips you have left. Your bluffs will cost you 750, but when your opponents try to bluff you back, it will cost him much more than that when he's wrong. This is a very aggressive style, but as you can see, when done properly, the losses are manageable. You aren't making any monster bluffs with this approach that risk your tournament life. Instead, you'll be chopping away at smaller pots, looking to minimize damage until the right situation comes along where you finally do flop a big hand and someone plays a pot with you. As a general rule, you want to do the majority of your bluffing in the small pots while having the best of it in any of the big pots that you play.